So this is going to be more of a higher level talk. So I'm not getting into more of the details on this. And this is going to be more of a discussion just about formatters in general. So I was just playing around with some different formatters that are out there. So BufferWriter, I'm going to talk a little bit about BufferWriter, lib format, standard format, and then just a little bit about sprintf. Or snprintf. So why replace snprintf? So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to do this. Type safety, however, I mean, this is kind of not as big of a point because a lot of modern compilers do give pretty good warnings. There's still issues, memory safety. If you're using sprintf, if you're using sprintf instead of snprintf, you can overrun your buffers, things like that. So extensibility, being able to just print out any class like BufferWriter can do, standard format can do, and then lib format can do. Generally modern formatters can do this kind of stuff. And then easier to use. Everybody's kind of consolidated onto Python formatting. No more of this crazy printf syntax. Which generally you compile and then you get an error and you go back in and fix it. And performance. So is it better? Is it not? We'll talk about that. I do have some benchmarks. They're pretty simple benchmarks. So most of our code right now is snprintf or printfs, and we do have some sprintfs still in there. I think I grepped through our code and we have 28 of them still. So looking at standard format, maybe I should have had these out of order, but just looking at standard format, since that's kind of like where things are headed in the future. It's part of the C++ 20 standard. There's some other stuff that's being added into C++ 23, like the standard print. However, if you look at compilers, it takes like GCC 13 or Clang 16 to go ahead and to start using standard format, which you're talking like Fedora 38, which came out this year. So what did 40? I think it came out this year. Yeah. So and that's what I'm running. That's the modern operating system. So there's no way we're going to switch over to standard format. I don't see that there's even a possibility for it for ATS 10. Maybe ATS 11 or something like that later down the road, but there's no way. I don't think we can move over to standard format. It's a subset of the lib format code, and same author, Victor, over at Facebook. Has been working on lib format, and they basically took a subset of that, and then that became the standard. So if you look at example of standard format, one thing that I haven't seen is a way to print to a buffer that's allocated on the stack. You would have to, do that yourself. I didn't see a common way to do that, or if people are actually doing that. I didn't see any examples. So this is the example that I set up. Is just create a string to a reserve and then print to it. And this is an example of if you have a widget class that has name, quantity, price in it. This is what you have to do. So you have to do templates and stuff. It's kind of funky, but it's kind of copy and paste code.
Yeah, actually, that's very interesting because, the primary design criteria for BufferWriter initially was able to write to arbitrary buffers from arbitrary places.
What do you mean by that?
Go to your previous slide.
Yep.
Right. So you're saying, well, you didn't know how to do it on a stack, right? For BufferWriter, yep. The whole point is that I don't care where the memory came from. It can come from absolutely anywhere.
Yeah, I think what they want is they want output iterators. So you can do buffer begin. So you can, depending on what your class is, depending on what that is, they just want an iterator on it.
How do they know the size?
I do not. I don't know.
Anyway, let's move on. Sorry,
I don't know.
I'm rat holing. Let's move on.
Good question. So the other one, FMT or lib format. There's more function helpers than standard format. You can do colors, underline, bolds, italics. But I don't know if that's not really that important. It's the precursor to standard format. It's used in quite a few projects. They list 47. You can read them yourself. They have quite a few contributors. It does do a lot of const expert compile time support. And they do have this cool thing called FMT compile, which I'll show. I have an example, and it helps out in the benchmarks. So basically, very similar to BufferWriter, you create a memory buffer. I believe that it does 500 bytes locally to begin with, and then it'll expand it up beyond 500 bytes. Don't know if it's actually allocated on the stacker heap. That one I don't know. I have to double check. So this is basically a example of it. You give it a back inserter, and then give it the buffer, and very syntax to all of them. And then there's an interesting thing is you can do like a format compile. My understanding is that it pre-processes this string ahead of time at compile time. I don't know all the details on format compile. There isn't a lot of good documentation that I've seen out there on it, but it makes things a lot faster.
So that format compile isn't necessary in modern C++ because it can just use const expert evaluation. You can still put format compile, but I don't think you need it anymore.
I thought it turned to a no-op, didn't it?
My benchmarks show differently.
No, you just have to need it because what's the type that's being passed into format to? In the first case, it's char const star. In the second case, is some FMT type. Right. So those are very different. And there's no way the compiler can figure out, oh, for this particular string, you really meant to pass it as an FMT type. It can't possibly know that. You have to tell it.
They should make a string literal.
Well, that's another way you can do it, right? That is in fact probably what I would do is rather than having that FMT compile, you put underscore, FMT or something on it to say, pre-compile this. But you still have to do something to change the type.
Yeah.
I think it turns it around, and you pass you give it something if you want it to be checked at runtime instead of compile time. I'll send you the link.
So again, if you want to go ahead and print out like a widget class, almost exactly the same syntax of standard format. I mean, it's of course because that standard format is just a subset of lib format. BufferWriter, we already have it. It's already part of ATS. It's included in libswak, which you already compile in. We talked a little bit about the const expert support. You're saying that there isn't or not, or
no, there's not really. I'd have to look at see how that was done.
Okay. I mean, it's similar to standard format, lib format. One nice thing about libswak is it has the local BufferWriter, which is the buffer. So you're saying that on the local BufferWriter, when you say like 256, it won't expand or will expand?
It will not expand.
Okay, will not expand.
Yeah, and there's also fixed BufferWriter, which is where you give it the buffer and say, here's the buffer you're going to write on, and whatever buffer you happen to laying around, here you go.
And then one thing that was interesting is when I was just doing some like writing benchmarks and stuff, it was kind of interesting. GitHub Copilot does know all about BufferWriter. It completes the syntax for you, and I even checked out ChatGPT. It also knows all about BufferWriter.
Okay, that's
so you can actually ask it examples and stuff like that, which is interesting. So, I mean, this is an example that I did. These are basically out of the benchmarks that I did when I'm showing these examples. So, local BufferWriter, and then you do BW print. So this prints it into the buffer. And this is one thing that's kind of nice about BufferWriter is that it is easier. I think it's cleaner to go ahead and to extend the formatting on classes. Like Alan was saying that he uses function overloading versus templates. and it just kind of makes it a lot cleaner. Benchmarking. So I think all of these are pretty fast. So I don't know if I've never really seen printing being our bottleneck. But if you look at the different benchmarks, so everything's compared off of SNPrintf, since that's kind of what we have in our code base. This is basically this. This is all on, wait, not that one. This is all I'm doing. This is the benchmark, you know, and I'm doing the same similar thing with standard format and lib format and BufferWriter and SNPrintf, all those. So the fastest one was format, and this is when you compile it, gets down to 9.3 milliseconds. BufferWriter is 71 nanoseconds. But I mean, they're all fast. I mean, I don't think that formatting is really going to be a bottleneck, so I don't even know if it's, I mean, if you want to save nanoseconds, I mean, yeah. The interesting thing is, so lib format.
Ask a question here quickly, Brian.
Yep.
And it's for Alan, actually. Do we know if we're using any of these formatters in the critical path? This would generally be sort of in the off the critical path, right?
No, there's quite a lot of them in the critical path, like for instance, the VS string. So, but again, if you save, you know, 30 nanoseconds in the VS string printing, you're never ever going to notice that, right? And it's comparable to we're using SNPrintf, so the percent change is really small. It's way smaller than comparing it to compiled format. Right. So when I was originally building it, that's what I was trying. My goal was to get within striking distance of SNPrintf, because then it's not much. It's very little slower than what we have now.
Yeah, I think when I benchmarked it a few years ago, I mean, BufferWriter's slower. The performance has gotten a lot better.
What is format compiled versus format? Is there an option?
All it is this. So, like I was talking about before, it's this last line right here.
Okay.
Where you just do format compile. And
can we add something like that to BufferWriter, Alan?
Well, it already has that. I'd have to look. I don't understand how they get much faster. I saw about a 1/3 speed improvement if I used. So if the first example was 100% runtime, then the second example was 67% runtime. So it was faster. It wasn't a huge amount faster. The rendering of the value items just seemed to be, and that was just for like a single value. If you put more than a few values in there, the expression parsing time just becomes noise. That was my experience. Maybe I can do better about the compiling. I don't know.
Yeah, the gut reaction here is like besides the format compile, everything else is sort of like roughly the same, right? It's not a big deal, but it's a noticeable difference of format compile. So there might be something to examine there, Alan, honestly.
Yeah, I guess the question is, they obviously can't get the values at compile time, so
no.
Maybe they use the types to pre-allocate buffers. One of the things you could do faster if you could say, well, I know that this type has a maximum field width of n characters, so I'll have a static buffer that I can render into.
I would guess
I'd have to look at it.
I don't know what your compile does, but I would imagine it should be doing things like finding the first occurrence of an expansion and whatnot, so you can jump right to that place, right? The pointer immediately, stuff like that.
Yeah, we could do that. Unfortunately, in BufferWriter, it doesn't get the name binding until you actually render. So in fact, the format string can be used with different name bindings.
Yeah, could you move to the next slide? Because I think the double was very different from the int.
Yeah, double. So it's interesting. You look at a lot of the benchmarks that format does, they compare itself to like double and stuff. So double, this was kind of interesting. I don't know how much. I think we print more integers than we do doubles.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go ahead and also do a double to see how, and I think this is more of how people are converting the double into a string than it is anything else. So SNPrintf, I mean, everything is faster than that.
Wow.
BufferWriter is like very close to now the format compiled, and it's not compiled. So,
but see, this goes back to what I'm saying is that if you just do ints, then I would guess that format compiled has special provisions for ints. And once you get away from ints, your rendering time of your objects starts to dominate. That was just my experience. Will, I think this is hilarious because it was Will who wrote that code, the double formatting code. I didn't write that. Will did.
It's fast.
We'll have to let him know that. That's just hilarious.
Yeah, that was an interesting surprise on that, because I mean, if you look at from one benchmark to the next, it's like, okay, doubles really BufferWriter pulls on that one. Right ahead.
Yeah, I think also the big point also to make here, Leif sort of said, is that there's sort of noise between them. In general, I think overall we're going to see BufferWriter and the standard format is going to be faster than SprintF, but the speed issue is nice. The real value is the type safety.
So another thing that I talk about in this benchmark is on standard format. This is when I was just reusing a string instead of creating a new string all the time. And then this is the new string for each time that it actually prints into the buffer. So I was expecting more of a difference in performance, but there isn't. And that's basically it on that. So the other thing that kind of surprised me too is how crappy the support for standard format is right now. That's going to be a long time before we can actually move to it inside of ATS. I was hoping that we would actually be able to use standard format sooner. So we need to kind of probably think about what we want to do forward. Standard format's not it, at least for now. Do we want to go there in the future? If so, how do we get there?
Well, I'm going to be blunt and say, I think what this tells me is we should stick with BufferWriter for now. We should make sure that the format specifications are absolutely identical or as close as possible to standard format. And then when we finally get to the point where standard format is viable, we switch over. I don't see the advantage of switching to lib format at this time. If we're going to switch to standard format in the future anyway, we should just wait for that and then move. Like standard file system, right? At some point, we have the SWAC file, which does the file system stuff. But at some point, standard file system will be well developed enough that we can dump that.
Yeah, I agree.
We changed everything around in there so it was very much or identical to standard file system. So that when we do switch, it's not going to be a big project.
Yeah, and then to your point about like you could implement BufferWriter in terms of format when that makes sense, right? Like keep the semantic things we like and keep the like in-place buffer support, but you could write an output iterator that does the fixed buffer thing, and then whenever you get to the end, it just, I don't know if there's a way to short it out, but it basically stops writing at that point.
Yeah, I mean, what you probably want to do is you want to take, when you saw the earlier diagram, you had the renderer, the thing that actually does the work. You'd keep that, but you make it a shell around standard format, right? So everything just says, well, I'm going to, you hollow everything out and BufferWriter out, so it simply says, well, I'm going to call standard format when I need to actually do stuff, and not call.
And when it makes sense, right? Like,
yeah. But you'll notice that if you look at those things, almost all the, like this, it's written in terms of calling BW format again. That's what print does, right? So the places where it actually gets down to the rendering, there's not a lot in the code, and you just say, well, those will be standard format, right? Or we pass standard, change the type from SWAC BDF format to, whatever the internal FMT lib type is for compiled format, right?
Yeah, I think the only thing is there's going to be, if we, how should I say it? So if we switch, when you switch from BufferWriter to say standard format, the extensions on being able to like print any classes, but I think that change is quite a bit there. I mean, there is some I don't know exactly how you're doing your parsing of your format specifiers and stuff like that. I mean, that's one thing that's nice about lib format is it's basically a copy of what standard format is.
Well, lib format is a superset. It has many more
it's a
features
superset.
than standard format does.
Exactly.
I think I've used lib format quite a lot internally for some of my projects, and it's pretty damn awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And the nice thing too is that it's almost becoming a standard. It's surprising that they didn't took more of lib format into standard format, but that would be my concern too here. Like BufferWriter would be essentially someone coming in who is used to either lib format or format has to at least spend some time understanding the nuances and the differences.
Well, my small take is I think the biggest difference we're going to have between BufferWriter and standard format is how some of the type semantics are going to be handled, right? Alan's doing it with overloading, the other one's with templates, and that's sort of a jarring change.
Right.
Well, I think you could also do one in terms of the other. Like the template thing is all compile time, right? So you're not all that resolution's done there versus a more dynamic dispatch. I don't know if it's dynamic dispatch. I don't know how it's implemented.
Yeah, I'm just saying that the code is semantically sort of different in a way.
Certainly,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think the function dispatch is the big deal. I think what happens, whether it's virtual functions or not, I think the key difference is if you have pure templates, it can frequently not ever call a function.
Right. It's more likely to be just this compiler sees through all of it.
Yeah, sees through all of it and says, well, I'm just not even bother with any function calls or stack frames. I think the difference between direct calls and virtual functions is minor compared to the ability to simply not call a function.
Yeah, and just to keep in mind that in theory, the aspect is that these templates won't be a big deal because, they're, like you said, they're going to be compiled and we're going to have standard C++ modules that work properly everywhere. And the modules will make the compile time concerns go away.
It just reminded me that I forgot to mention module support in my CMake talk. Dang.
Yeah, but my concern was on that subject. I'm a little worried about that support because I don't think it's standardized yet. The compilers are sort of all over the place on that subject.
Not only is it not standardized, they probably won't standardize it, and they're going to leave it up to the tools to figure out.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other fun subject.
Yeah.
So I think we need to make a decision at some point. What are we going to do about our formatters and how we're going to go forward on that? Does everybody believe that we're going to go to standard format eventually?
I don't know. Like to Leif's point, it's kind of like, why make a standard and not just let lib format or whatever be the de facto standard? Like, are they just wanting there to be a standard? Like, why not take the whole thing then? Like, why?
Having looked at it,
take 21 years to get the thing finished.
Well, I mean, they don't have the coloring in standard format, right? Because there's some system outside the Windows, Mac, Linux operating systems, which the stuff probably runs on, and it doesn't have coloring. So people may complain that it's not there. So they just took what they knew worked everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're in some ISO world where you can only use standard things, then it's nice to be able to use that or have it there. But like in the real world, I don't know why you wouldn't just use lib format.
Well, let me ask. So Alan has been doing this the most, right? Other than the being able to write to arbitrary buffers, that sort of stuff. When it comes to the formatting, the actual syntax of the format strings, how much would we lose if we went to standard format and restricted to only that?
We'd lose a few things, some really nice convenience mechanisms, like for instance the Erno wrapper. You can pass extensions about whether you want the long name, the short name, or the number in the extension thing. So it becomes very easy to say, to put in the format which parts of the Erno you want. Otherwise, you'd have to have multiple wrapper classes or pass it to the wrapper. So you could always do that. You could always move the extension to the wrapper.
Right.
Well, lib format like you can have your own specifier string.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I know there's something.
so Chris, you can extend it with the sort of the rich format that say lib format has.
Yeah, you have to provide it a parser.
Yeah, that's what the whole parse. That's what that parser was. Is that when you actually specified it?
Right.
Yeah.
But that was for lib format, though, right, Brian?
For both lib format and standard format.
That's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, it's the same thing. But I didn't do it. If you look at it, so I didn't do anything in the parser. I just go ahead and I just send back the begin.
They're tedious, but I mean,
Yeah, I've written a bunch of these for crypts. It was very tedious.
Yeah. But yeah, standard format has exactly the same thing.
But this would imply then that we could possibly take some of these existing formatters, because there's extensions in lib format as well. You can do all sorts of magic with things like chrono time stamps and chrono time periods and that sort of stuff. We can do all sorts of nifty formatting. And it sounds like we could just take that from lib format and move it into our code, and it would work with standard format.
I don't know how much of that is being transferred over to standard format, but
well, I'm guessing that they just didn't want to include all of it, right? But if it's essentially the same type of templating APIs,
I think Jason probably had it right. What they didn't want to transfer over is all the funky coloring and other special, output formatting support for console devices. It was just raw text. I bet they took all of that because who cares? But getting all of that other stuff working on different systems is really, really hard. Like standard file system, right? There's nothing tricky about standard file system. It's just an endless slog of every little variant of every little OS and every little file system and getting it right.
Well, I mean,
that's
think about this. If you go with the standard, we know the compilers are going to provide it, and you don't have a third-party library. That's the main advantage there. If you go with the Facebook library here, right, we get all that stuff plus some extra niceties, right, which I think we could take advantage of in Traffic Server because of at least the platforms we support. And otherwise, we keep with the BufferWriter, and we make that as a migration path to standard format or to the lib format, and we just see where the standard goes in the next couple of years with it.
Yeah, we have to have the arbitrary buffer writing. That is actually, that's the primary use case. We do that so many places and so many times in Traffic Server that it's absolutely critical. We can't, the other stuff we could probably get around, but that we can't. We have to have that.
So we feel the risk is low that lib format will become abandonware.
Well, yes and no. I think it will, but it'll because it's been all moved into standard format.
yeah, which is
so who cares?
Yeah,
Really?
who cares?
Alan, that requirement to be able to write into an arbitrary buffer, maybe on the stack, can that be achieved with standard format?
I have no idea.
I think
Brian
it
said he
can.
couldn't find it.
I couldn't find it, but I think it can. I'm not sure.
I mean, the same example that you gave Brian, that would have used it potentially on the heap, right? That depends on how much you standard string puts on the stack.
Yes.
But
like
what Alan is saying is,
but...
I want to know, hey, I have a buffer of 4,096 bytes on the stack. I want to write to it. How would you guarantee that? Unless
I know lib format does it. I haven't seen any examples of standard format. So I
like all the header heap writing, right? You pick a piece out of the header heap and you say, you got to write to this piece of the header heap. There's no option.
Well, what is it the big difference we're trying to talk about here is that I think the BufferWriter is fixed, right? You say I have this much memory and that's it. And it doesn't automatically go pre-allocate a bunch of new stuff for you.
Yeah, well, that's another issue, but we could probably work on it. But the key point is when we built BufferWriter, clipping at the buffer end was absolutely right. Again, the header heap. When you run out of that piece of the header heap you're allocated, you can't get more. You just have to stop. That's why all the behavior ran before we started using it. So
Yeah,
I'm
but
not
that's
looking at
a
that.
feature on performance, right? Because if you do the nice to have thing, which is just start popping more memory in there automatically in some
No, it's a
way.
correctness thing, because then you lose track of where that memory is, right? Again, with the header heap, there's really you can't attach more memory to the header heap. It's just not how it works. You may, if you want to rewrite header heap.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm saying is that, you start adding all this extra memory on it and you lose the value of what you're trying to do, because like you said, you get this arena that can grow somehow, right? And you could track it technically in theory, but it becomes messy to do so.
Yeah, it requires some pretty extensive core changes to make that work.
Yeah, but then you lose the performance impact that you got on it, and that causes all kinds of other hiccups.
Possibly. Anyway, but no, if there's one feature that's absolutely undeniable, it's being able to write to arbitrary fixed pieces of memory.
Okay, so we're running late here.
So did we come with an answer? Are we just saying let's go with BufferWriter for right now, and then let
Yeah,
us
I think we should
play with
do
the other
that.
stuff for now and come back to this like next summit next year?
Yeah.
I don't know. I would probably go with lib format because it'd be easier transition to format. But I mean, that's me, and I mean, I'm not the only one voting here. So
Can we get an example of what would entail to, the formatting stuff would probably be straightforward, but this arbitrary buffer thing, and you said that was possible in lib format. Can we see how involved that would be to make that change? I'm leaning towards lib format as well. I think it's a pretty great library.
yeah, I think we should probably come up with some examples, like looking and seeing arbitrary buffers and how to write to them and stuff like that.
Right. It seems premature to vote on it before we know if it's actually even feasible, right?
Yeah.
But that would be if you're going to vote on anything, my vote would be that we spend some time understanding if lib format can satisfy our requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And if it can, then we can go to a vote again. But then I think that we should go for lib format.
Right. So the only question, I'm not against lib format by any means. I guess the question here is Alan was making a big deal about the fixed buffer, the fixed memory basically sets to do stuff. And my understanding from lib format, and again, I'm not an expert over there, that was by default dynamic and you couldn't restrict growth.
I've seen it where or some people have done like char star and or char buffers and then go ahead and write into it. I would have to look at those more in detail. I haven't really looked at examples.
Yeah. So the only reason why I bring that up is because if the fixed buffer size without allowing growth to happen is a feature, that's something to consider.
There's a format to in, I guess, that maybe would handle the don't grow past in. And then the output iterator implementation would decide whether it's a start at the beginning or append to what's there. Right? I don't know. Yeah, I think somebody needs to just play with it and see.
Yeah, I would also like, if someone's going to look at that, looking at the name binding and the argpack stuff would be important, because those are not absolutely necessary, but they're really, really nice.
Like if you look at the example on this page here.
You can share it if you want. Or,
oh, I pasted it. This is standard format. I imagine lib format's the same.
okay, so in here they have format to end. Okay. I didn't see that. So you have to pass in the size of the buffer, of course.
Yeah, and I think you could wrap this up to make it less, I don't know, cumbersome, I guess. It's like adding the null pointer to null terminator there.
Yeah, it's almost like it's in
we want an example of what happens on the error case. So I don't quite see that there. Like what happens when you do the overwrite?
Exception.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, you pass in in as the buffer size -1, so you know that whatever out's going to be is not going to be past that, I guess. So result that out would be the iterator to the end, or where it stopped writing.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's equal to the last element in the buffer, then you would have overridden it, or perfectly nailed it, which is always hard to determine.
Yeah, well, in this one, they perfectly nails it. They nail it, or what? No, or the buffer. They assume that the buffer. So? That's interesting because can't result.out ever point past your buffer?
If you put the wrong in there, I suppose.
Yeah, I would think so.
Well, I think we're rat holing and we're behind, so I think
Yep.
we should look at this and revisit it again at the next summit to see if anyone's figured out how to make this stuff work.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily need to wait till next summit. If someone is willing to
Yeah.
spend time on this, we can spend. I mean, even if the answer is no, this BufferWriter has to stay because there's no way to do what we need lib format to do, then that's fine too. Then we just make a decision.
Yeah.
It's not even a vote at that point, right? It's just not doable.
Yeah.